few years back, I had just moved into a new apartment. It was a nice place, quiet neighborhood, clean and spacious. The kind of place you don't usually find in the city. It had a strange layout, though. The bedroom was right next to the kitchen, and there was a large air vent on the wall between the two rooms. At first, I didn't think much of it. I'd just moved in and was too busy unpacking to focus on details. After a few nights, I started noticing odd sounds. At first, it was just faint creaking, almost like someone moving around the apartment. But I convinced myself it was the building settling or just my neighbors. I'd lie awake some nights listening to that faint creak, telling myself it was nothing. One night, as I lay in bed reading, I heard something distinctly different, a whisper. It was so faint I almost missed it, and I couldn't make out any words, but it sounded close. I sat up, my heart pounding, listening intently. Then it came again, soft but unmistakable. "Hello." It was coming from the air vent in my bedroom. A chill ran down my spine as I stared at the vent, trying to rationalize what I'd heard. I told myself it was just the building, or maybe the neighbor's TV echoing through the walls. But it didn't sound like a TV. It sounded like someone speaking directly through the vent. I ignored it, thinking maybe I was just tired. But the next night, it happened again. The same faint whisper, as though someone was saying, "Hello." But this time, it was followed by soft laughter. The hair on my arms stood up as I listened, frozen in place. I couldn't sleep that night. The whispering stopped after a few minutes, but I kept hearing faint, unexplainable sounds. Soft, shuffling movements, almost like breathing. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear it again, pulling me back into a restless wakefulness. The next morning, I went down to speak with my landlord. I explained what I'd heard, but he just shrugged it off, saying the building was old and sounds traveled through the walls in strange ways. He assured me there was nothing to worry about, but his casual dismissal left me feeling uneasy. That night I went to bed, but I kept a small light on, hoping it would give me some sense of security. I lay there straining to hear any sound, but there was only silence. I finally began to relax, telling myself I'd just let my imagination get the better of me. And then, the whispering started again. This time it was clearer. It wasn't just hello anymore. I heard a faint, raspy voice coming through the vent, saying, "I see you." I sat up, staring at the vent, heart racing. My mind was screaming at me to get out, to leave, but I felt glued to the spot, too terrified to move. The whispering continued, growing slightly louder, and I realized with horror that it was saying my name. "Sarah! Sarah! I see you!" I finally broke free from my paralysis, grabbing my phone and calling my friend, begging her to come over. I couldn't stand being alone in that apartment any longer. She agreed, and I waited outside until she arrived. When she pulled up, I explained everything, and we decided to stay at her place for the night. The next morning, I went back with her to get some clothes. I was exhausted and terrified, but I had to face it. We walked in, and the apartment felt cold, like the heat had been turned off, even though I'd left it on. I felt a sense of dread the moment we stepped inside, like we were intruding. That's when we noticed the vent. It had been pulled out from the wall slightly, almost as if someone had tried to remove it. My friend pointed it out, and I felt my stomach drop. There was no reason for it to be that way. I hadn't touched it, and the vent was too high for me to reach without a ladder. We got out of there as fast as we could, and I called my landlord immediately. I told him about the vent, insisting he check it out. He seemed reluctant but agreed to meet me later that day. When he arrived, he brought a maintenance worker with him. The worker climbed up, examining the vent, and then, with a strange look on his face, he shone his flashlight into it and pulled out a microphone. I stared, stunned, as he handed it to the landlord. It was small, but it looked professional, like something you'd use for surveillance. The maintenance worker then reached back inside the vent and pulled out a small speaker, the kind that could transmit audio in real time. Someone had set up a microphone and speaker system inside my vent, positioned perfectly to hear everything in my bedroom and transmit it back. The landlord was horrified, apologizing profusely, but he had no idea how it had gotten there. I filed a police report, but they never found out who had set it up or how long it had been there. I moved out that week, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. To this day, I wonder who was listening, and worse, who was whispering my name, knowing I'd hear it alone in the dark. When I was in college, I rented a small old apartment near campus with my friend Sam. It was an old building full of quirks, pipes that clanked, radiators that barely worked, and walls so thin you could hear the neighbors talking. It wasn't perfect, but it was close to school, and the rent was affordable. One night, a couple of months after we moved in, I was up late studying. The apartment was quiet. Sam had gone to bed hours earlier. Around midnight, I heard a strange noise, a faint rustling, like someone shifting through papers. I assumed it was Sam, maybe awake for a midnight snack or something, but when I peeked into his room, he was sound asleep. I went back to my room, dismissing it as a quirk of the old building, but then the noises grew louder. This time it was a distinct, scratching sound, like something dragging against the walls. I pressed my ear to the wall, feeling my heartbeat quicken. The scratching was coming from inside the wall, moving up, then down, like someone or something was trying to find a way out. I woke Sam, trying to sound calm, but I could tell he was just as freaked out as I was. We spent the rest of the night listening to the sounds, too scared to sleep. Eventually, the scratching stopped, and we convinced ourselves it was probably an animal trapped inside the wall. The next day, we called the landlord, who assured us he'd send someone over to check it out. But weeks passed, and the sounds only got worse. Every few nights, just around midnight, the scratching would start again. One night, I swear, I heard something that sounded almost like a voice. A faint, whispering sound, but too muffled to make out any words. I was too scared to tell Sam. Then one evening, Sam and I returned to the apartment after a late night studying at the library. As we walked in, we noticed an awful smell, like rotten food mixed with damp earth. It was strongest near the hallway, just outside our bedrooms. As we approached, we saw something that made my skin crawl. A piece of wallboard near the floor was slightly detached, as though someone had pried it loose from the other side. That night, neither of us could sleep. Every creak, every faint rustle felt like it was getting louder, closing in. We spent the night sitting on the couch, holding on to whatever items we could use to defend ourselves, just in case. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. I woke up a few hours later to a quiet, eerie silence. I turned to check on Sam, but he wasn't next to me. I stood up, glancing around the darkened room, calling his name. I heard his muffled voice coming from his room, and a chill ran down my spine. I slowly opened his door, and there he was, staring at the wall near his bed. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my voice shaky. He pointed to the wall, and that's when I saw it. A pair of eyes watching us through a small hole that had been carved out, just big enough for someone to peer through. We screamed, bolting out of the apartment and calling the police from a nearby diner. The officers arrived quickly, and when they searched the apartment, they made a horrifying discovery. Behind the wall, there was a narrow crawl space that ran the length of the apartment, and at the far end of it, they found a small makeshift bed, scattered with scraps of food and dirty clothes. The smell we'd noticed earlier was coming from there. But the worst part? They found signs that someone had been living there for months, watching us through holes they'd carved in the walls. The police never caught whoever it was. They disappeared before we returned that night. Sam and I moved out the next day, but I still have nightmares about those eyes, watching us from inside the walls.